There's a calmness here. Beauty springs from simplicity. Its residents hold tightly to conventions and charm. And yet, this pastoral setting cloaks disquieting irony, for this place has also suffered extreme violence, raging destruction, and economic decay. It is this particular paradox that makes Cherry Valley such an exciting historical study in human dignity and survival. Hello, I'm Fred Miller, your host for this special program. For the next half hour, we'll share in this fascinating story. History is an elusive concept. One always wonders where to begin. For example, we know that this place, now called Cherry Valley, was first named Caratonga by local Indians prior to white settlement in the mid-18th century. Its natural beauty and resources must have been highly prized by those Native Americans. We can also imagine that struggle, survival, and renewal were central to their lives. But we can only imagine. Detailed accounts of the Indians' early relationship with this land were both speculative and rare. Cherry Valley's written chronicles begin in 1738. That was the year New York's Lieutenant Governor, George Clark, secured the 7,050-acre tract from England's King George. He then asked John Lindsay, an adventurous Scot and High Sheriff of Albany County, to establish a settlement on this land. Lindsay moved his wife, father-in-law, and domestics to this area. He called his new home Lindsay's Bush. The following winter was frigid and unexpectedly cruel. Frequent storms left them stranded without enough food or supplies. A Mohawk Indian, in fact, found the Lindsays near starvation. He snowshoed back and forth from different Mohawk settlements with enough provisions to get the family through the winter. His compassion saved the lives of these early settlers. The following year, the Reverend Samuel Dunlop accepted several hundred free acres to settle at Lindsay's Bush. He persuaded several families from Londonderry, New Hampshire, to move with him. The Reverend Dunlop was no ordinary frontiersman. In fact, he was a literary scholar, a graduate of Ireland's Trinity College, and most recently touring the provinces of America. But it was the Reverend's sensitive intellect that gave this rustic settlement a promising future and its name. While discussing with Lindsay how a letter should be dated, Dunlop suggested Cherry Valley because of the many wild cherry trees in the forest. By 1743, under his guidance, the settlers had established a church and school. The Reverend Dunlop presided over both. The school, in particular, attracted students from across the Mohawk Valley, eager to attend the only classical academy west of Albany at the time.
It was God's light that transformed this wilderness. His word rang out in our rustic church. The complex beauty of His creation was discovered by the children in our school, and his name brought faith to the 7 Scot-Irish families from Londonderry, New Hampshire, who came with me to join in this great adventure.
But Lindsay lost heart. Not skilled in practical farming, he left with his family and re-entered military service. Cherry Valley's vulnerable isolation, particularly during the French and Indian Wars, made most settlers think twice before moving in. Still, Cherry Valley had become a sort of civilized outpost that offered more than just fertile ground. Here, settlers also found spiritual comfort, a sense of community, and a classical education for their children. By 1775, more than 300 people had settled in Cherry Valley. Concerns over stamped paper, human rights, and taxation without representation rang out in Cherry Valley that year. Many of the settlers, being Irish, Scots, French, Canadian, also came from anti-British cultures. And finally, news of clashes in Lexington and Concord further bolstered resolve against the smothering rule of King George. Soon, Cherry Valley citizens met at their community church to firmly establish their role in the American Revolution.
Gentlemen, if I may, this document, which we have all agreed to, represents Cherry Valley's position. We declare our fixed attachment to the proceedings held in Philadelphia last fall, and that we repose our confidence in the wisdom and integrity of the present Continental Congress. Gentlemen, in a word, gentlemen, it is our fixed resolution to be free or die.
Cherry Valley's finest had set off for war by 1776. All able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 60 joined or were drafted into the Tryon County militia. Colonel Samuel Campbell, a prominent member of the community, served in that militia.
Our newborn patriotism consumes us. Freedom can be won, but this is a risky venture. We're leaving young boys, women, and old men to guard our homes. Homes built in a wilderness bursting with danger, even in the best of times.
Yet during the first year, most upstate communities were left unscathed by the war. Local Tory leaders had fled to Canada for their own safety. British troops were busy elsewhere. At the same time, England's Indian allies found little reason to attack settlements filled with people who had been their friends over the past few decades. But the calm was shattered in 1777. That was the year the British launched a three-pronged campaign to win control of the Hudson Valley. Burgoyne would lead his troops south from Montreal by way of Lake Champlain. Another force would move up the Hudson Valley from New York City. A third force, led by Barry St. Leger, would travel east from Oswego across the Mohawk Valley and join Burgoyne at midpoint. St. Leger's force of 1,400 men, halfway between Oswego and the Hudson Valley, lay siege to Fort Stanwix. The fort, well fortified and provisioned, was prepared for an extended battle. Nonetheless, reinforcements were expected. General Herkimer moved the Tryon County militia, which included 800 to 1,000 men, toward Fort Stanwix. St. Leger, warned of Herkimer's advance, dispatched a welcoming party under Sir John Butler and the Mohawk chief, Joseph Brant. That company included 20 regular troops, 50 loyalists, and 400 Indians. The result was horrifying. Herkimer's troops were caught in a bloody ambush just 5 miles from Fort Stanwix at Oriskany Creek on the morning of August 6, 1777. 200 patriots lost their lives. Herkimer was wounded and died 2 days later as well. Cherry Valley's own Samuel Campbell took over Herkimer's command. British losses included the deaths of 3 English soldiers, 3 to 4 loyalists, and 33 Indian warriors. The surviving Indians left the battlefield enraged, finding little comfort in the much larger death count suffered by the Patriots. Within days, Tory and Indian forces began a fierce campaign that left half the Schoharie Valley in ruins by the end of September. Cherry Valley's residents built a hasty stockade around Colonel Campbell's home for protection, but it was clearly inadequate.
The Cherry Valley settlement, by all accounts, is an open, defenseless, and unguarded frontier, left without the ammunition, men, nor fortifications needed to defend itself.
At General Lafayette's command, a more substantial fort was eventually built around the town's church. General Lafayette was also persuaded to lay in troops at Cherry Valley by the spring of 1778. But the choice of command became a death sentence for the settlement.
I don't understand. Colonel Ichabod Alden, a Connecticut man, took charge of the fort today. He seems terribly inexperienced and overconfident. For example, he refuses to let us keep our families and belongings in the fort for protection. We objected, of course, reminding them that a number of the neighboring settlements have already been attacked and burned recently. But Colonel, he seems so unconcerned. He apparently believes that the mere presence of his troops will be enough to frighten off any war parties. But we're not so sure.
On November 11th, 1778, the residents of Cherry Valley were attacked and massacred. 50 redcoats, 150 Tory Rangers, and more than 300 Indian warriors, all still bitter from the Battle of Oriskany, stormed the settlement. Colonel Alden was resting comfortably at the home of Robert Wells when the attack began. While running toward the fort, the colonel was killed. British and Tory troops charged the fort, leaving the Indians on their own. The carnage that followed was nearly indescribable. 13 people at the Wells home alone were killed. From there, Indians attacked and plundered the rest of the settlement in a near frenzy. The brutality and loss of life were appalling.
I can barely speak it. They have killed and maimed my gentle wife. The gruesome evidence now lies all about us. I'm undone. I'm destroyed.
Many credit Mohawks Joseph Brant and Little Aaron, also sickened by the horror, with saving a number of Cherry Valley citizens. But by the end of the day, 32 residents, mostly women and children, had been killed. 16 American soldiers had also lost their lives. 70 residents were taken prisoner. Among them were Colonel Samuel Campbell's wife and family, who were separated and held in various Indian encampments for several years. The Battle of Oriskany, and Colonel Campbell's part in it, had been avenged. The settlement was burned to the ground as well. Only the fort and church were left standing. The Reverend Dunlap left with his daughter, a broken man. He died just 2 years later. Still, some residents remained in Cherry Valley, convinced they could bring the shattered community back to life. Just 2 years later, on April 14, 1780, 2 Tories and 79 Indians attacked the struggling township. They killed 8 settlers and took 14 prisoners. This time, the town was completely destroyed. A shroud of brush and weeds covered 40 years of work. Cherry Valley seemed to vanish. But people like the Reverend Dunlap had built Cherry Valley on a human foundation of faith, trust, and belonging. Shortly after, independence was won. Then, former residents returned to the original site and raised Cherry Valley from the ashes. Among them were Colonel Samuel Campbell and his family.
This town holds terrible memories for me. My mother-in-law was brutally murdered. And as you know, my family was held captive by Indians for several years. And now my wife and children are back, safe and sound. It's time to start over, to build again in this place that means so much to us.
One of Colonel Campbell's first guests was General George Washington, who visited Cherry Valley in the fall of 1783. The father of our country was just one of many who traveled through the rebuilt settlement in those days. An increasing number of people were moving westward, and Cherry Valley was an excellent point of departure given its convenient location along New York's Central Corridor. Traffic became so great, in fact, that the first Great Western Turnpike Company built a 52-mile road from Albany to Cherry Valley in 1799. This was soon followed by an extension to Cooperstown and Sherburne, and another to Cazenovia and Manlius. The turnpike, now the shortest route from Albany to the west, elevated Cherry Valley from a rustic settlement to a bustling commercial center. Locals operated 8 stagecoach lines out of Cherry Valley, and the larger statewide lines made regular stops there as well. In addition, a steady flow of westbound covered wagons, also known as prairie schooners, passed through the town on a regular basis. By 1815, Cherry Valley included 80 family homes, a marble works, iron and brass foundries, tanneries, distilleries, hat factories, 15 taverns, stable room for 110 horses, and an expanding number of stores and churches. Cherry Valley Academy, a reincarnation of the Reverend Dunlap's classical school, was also held in high regard throughout New York State. Past principals included Dr. Eliphalet Knott, who later became president of Union College. This settlement, then, massacred and destroyed just 35 years earlier, had been reborn.
My father, Colonel Samuel Campbell, passed away today at the age of 86. He was a good father. He was also a courageous soldier, an American patriot. He and the others, like Reverend Dunlap, challenged adversity and won. This kind of commitment is still important to us. It's the bond that holds our village together, even in these troubled times.
And a major crisis was on its way. A crisis that would precipitate Cherry Valley's economic decline. In 1825, the Erie Canal was opened, diverting substantial traffic and money away from Cherry Valley. The Panic of 1837 and the completion of the New York Central Railroad in 1838 seriously depleted the village's economy as well. By 1844, virtually every business in the village had failed. Nevertheless, the community was extremely influential in state and national politics from 1835 to 1850. During that time, Cherry Valley furnished the state with 2 members of Congress, a surveyor general, a canal commissioner, 2 members of the Board of Regents, a national elector, and a justice of the Superior Court. Given the size of this modest village, such representation was truly phenomenal. By 1815, Cherry Valley had become a sleepy little village, no longer interested in being the economic and political hub of New York State. Its leaders had grown old. Their wealth, education, and influence were now used to maintain a more peaceful, bucolic community. That calm was shattered just 10 years later. Talk of a war between the states rumbled throughout the valley.
January 2nd, 1861. Some in the South wish to get out of the Union, hoping that concessions will be made. Others are for it, pure and simple. In like manner, there are men in the North who believe secession will afford a chance for coercion and civil war. Still others believe it will be a permanent separation, and they thank God for it, for they believe slavery is sin. But the worst of all of this is that all those differences of opinion tend to one great end, secession. And when that end is obtained, it may perhaps never be retraced. There are 1,000 roads to ruin, a few back. 1,000 gates that open inward to the realms of death. There are none that open outward.
1/10 of Cherry Valley's population, over 600 men, fought in the Civil War. 42 of them were killed. This monument was built by the town's citizens to honor their memory. It also marks the beginning of another challenge to Cherry Valley's perseverance. The Civil War had drawn its most robust and able men away from the community for too long. Business interests withered. The academy shut its doors. The town's factories stopped production. This was followed by a national post-war depression that lay over Cherry Valley like a shroud. The die was cast. Cherry Valley would never become a commercial center like Syracuse and Rochester. Its destiny ran toward a simpler way of life. That was its special quality now. Beauty, charm, and freedom from vexations. Cherry Valley was at peace. So much so that city folk made a point to spend their summers there. It was a place that nurtured friendships, strengthened family ties, fostered a reverence for nature, and provided a sense of intangible serenity. That ethic carried its residents into the 20th century and through 2 world wars. Sacrifices were made, lives were lost, but there was a bond that saw Cherry Valley's residents through the hard times. They didn't have large factories, transit systems, or expensive department stores. They just had each other. However, their economic survival was challenged one more time. Although the Cherry Valley Turnpike was no longer a major thoroughfare, the community continued to depend on the traffic and the money it brought. In 1937, the State Highway Department recommended that the turnpike be rerouted, bypassing the village for safety reasons. The townspeople exploded. A campaign was immediately launched to stop the bypass, and it was effective until 1952. It was then that the Cherry Valley Turnpike, known today as Route 20, was moved several miles to the north of the village. Cherry Valley was now isolated and hidden from view. Residents called the move the Second Great Massacre. But although Cherry Valley has been denied economic prosperity, it is still rich in other, and perhaps more important ways. In May of 1968, a young girl in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was asked by her teacher to write about the perfect place to live. Ellen Stone chose Cherry Valley as her Shangri-La.
In the 1920s, while my mother was growing up, she lived in a little town called Cherry Valley. The house was a copy of one that was built before the Revolution. There were many trees, gardens, and paths on which you could take a nice morning or evening walk. It also has open fields for horses to be kept and ridden. To me, there is no other place in the whole world that has everything I have ever wanted or would ever want to have, like this little place in Cherry Valley.
Ellen never actually moved to Cherry Valley, but she and her mother visit every year. Her essay, proudly published in the town's weekly paper, presents an ideally touching view of small-town life in America. It ignores the violence, destruction, and death that have also torn at life in Cherry Valley. But Ellen's view is the centerpiece to this town's history. Her dream has always been Cherry Valley's dream. That's why its story is so important to us. Hope springs eternal here in Cherry Valley.